I think the differences between directing and producing for TV is that, apart from the simple logistical difference of, as a producer you don't go out into the field. I sometimes say my job is to write the checks and send other people out to have fun. Is that you've got to have the complete overview. And there's always that tension between people who are in the business who, understand, I guess, to a certain extent that there's money attached to this and there's audiences attached to this and it's got to suit advertisers, and people who just, come from a more objective and pure kind of view of the world. And, you get the interesting thing being a producer who's been a director where you understand both sides of that coin. You want the art, but you want the commerce, or you understand that the commerce is what funds the art. So you've got to blend those two things together. And, I think my job as a producer a lot of the time is to make both of those things work together in a way that's somewhat satisfactory while keeping the two parties from arguing with each other. Because you don't want, to feed back to your director exactly what the network have said about their piece of art that they're really highly attached to. And by the same token, you have to mediate to a certain extent sometimes between the director's wish to make art or do things in a certain way when, the network might think that's pure wank. So I'm a troubleshooter. Well, when I went to university, it was always with the intention that I would go on to doing journalism. What I studied at university when I was there was New Zealand history, a reasonable amount of Māori language and Māori culture, tikanga, and some international politics and things like that. And then I completely screwed everything up by doing too much student media and running a radio station and, content editing a newspaper, which made the degree run for a bit longer than it needed to. But, that was the other part of the study, was to get through to the postgrad journalism at Canterbury. That was my first 1 hour documentary with a director's credit on it. Well, the central story from the accident from Flight 703 was that one of the survivors found his cell phone once he got out of the plane, and his name was William McGrory. He was kind of the hero of the story because he helped other people out, found his cell phone, called the emergency services, and in the fog and the confusion, they couldn't find him. So he was put on to the air traffic controller, and between him and the air traffic controller, they essentially guided the emergency services onto the hilltop where they found the plane. And so we got William and the air traffic controller, his surname was Chapman, together during the program, told both their stories about what had happened and how it had gone down, along with, interviews from the other survivors and sort of a discussion about how that had affected them, but also, what had caused the crash and what had changed since to, improve safety around the airport and things like that. Here to Stay was a career highlight, really. It was an opportunity to tell stories about New Zealand in context, the social history stuff, which is what I did my degree in. I've always been interested in the history of New Zealand and the makeup of the culture. Essentially, the brief was we need a show that talks about why Pākehā New Zealand culture is the way it is. And we were asked to respond to that with a couple of other companies, and we won the pitch to make the show, which we called Here to Stay. And it was broken down into different ethnic groups and their arrival in New Zealand, and from first ships to today, and what parts of New Zealand culture you can kind of attribute to their influence. So we had episodes on the Scots, on the Germans, on the English and the Irish. We had decent money, we had a good budget, we had really good directors on board. It just fed into my keenness to tell good social stories about New Zealand in a good broadcasting way, with good pictures, with good presenters, and talk about context. Without banging people over the head. What you miss from being a journalist on news is that you're always dealing with what happened today and who doesn't like it. You never get to talk about what that is in a cultural context, why it's got to that point, and what it really means going forward. And so with Here to Stay, where you're sort of talking about New Zealand culture and what makes up New Zealand culture, we had a lot of fun with how do we talk about concepts like humour, and how do we talk about concepts like our attitude to money, and where does that all come from? And if we're, thought to be a bit of a tall poppy country, or, somewhat a bit glum or stoic, or, our humour is incredibly ironic, generally speaking, then what can we kind of trace that back to in our cultural underpinnings? Doing things that are essentially crime stories, we like to force them into a bit of a social context and talk in them a little bit about how society's changed. Obviously undercover policing or detectives or the Armed Defenders Squad are very important social institutions that have a lot of effect on society, and we're attracted to that as a subject material, given that we're still got an entertainment bent, and our storytelling has to be around things that are going to be worth watching and fun to watch. The undercover story, the police would not get involved in, so we told the social history of undercover in 3 parts, starting from when it started, essentially sort of back in the 60s with the undercover vice squads, through to today, and all of the controversies. Unfortunately, because the police wouldn't tell the other side of the story, it did end up being a little bit about what was wrong with the undercover program. But as a result of that, we said, all right, what's next? And we decided that, and Alex Clark, who was the producer, was closely involved in this. Let's look at the Armed Defenders Squad on the same grounds, another public institution, publicly funded part of the police force, very important in our social history. What can we say about that? Because it was a different branch of the police, when we went in to go and talk to the tactical guys about doing this program, we essentially sat down in a meeting where they said, well, we get the feeling you're going to do this anyway, whether we cooperate or not, which is pretty much the case. So they decided they would cooperate, and they were good. And we never give over editorial control, and we consult for fact checking and things like that. We ended up changing one little thing in the program as a result of the conversation. Obviously, the Armed Defenders Squad has done a few things they're not very proud of, but that's just part of the story. And it's kind of rolled on from there. We then went, all right, well, TVNZ want another one. We're into series 2 of the detectives about the CIB. The fun of them is not only are they really good subject material with really good people, we do get to play around with dramas because they've got lots of reconstructions in them, and they just have a lot of visual impact, and they really tell good stories. It can be stressful. It can be a stressful job being a producer, but it's a great job, It's only as stressful sometimes as the subject material, or usually if it's stressful, you've made a mistake. Ultimately. Usually if it's stressful, then what you've done is pick the wrong team, put the wrong channel together with the wrong subject, done something that has led to a difficulty, not predicted a fault that was going to come up. Another thing about producing is that you've always got to have contingency plans. You've always got to be thinking ahead of what could go wrong or what's likely to go wrong, what personalities are going to either potentially clash or be weak in certain areas, and try and bolster a director who's really good on visuals but not so good on interviews with maybe a researcher who's really good on interviews. I think generally speaking, when it becomes stressful, someone hasn't done what you asked them to do, or you haven't planned it through properly, unless you've got a really stressful subject. So those 2 area accident documentaries that I did were quite stressful, and I think that Flight 703 in particular kept me awake at night, partly because it was one of my first, but partly because it was a difficult subject and we were working with people who had been through a really traumatic experience. The most stressful one I've done recently was how to spot a cult for TV3, where you're dealing with people who've A, been through very traumatic experiences, and B, you've got some quite strong enemies who don't really like what you're doing, to wit Scientology. So that was quite involving.